Well, good afternoon. I think we're right at time, so we'll go ahead and get started. But I appreciate you all being here today. I am Jen Reid. I head up strategy and marketing for Equifax Automotive. I'm just going to be really upfront. Not always the most sexy topic, right? Talking about credit reports and how to use it in underwriting, and so today, I'm going to spend some time really kind of diving in a little bit into the credit reports, but more focused on information around just how you can use it in your day-to-day, as well as talk about some additional assets that you can look at. My background is I spent 8 years on the dealership side, a lot of that in the used car space, and then I went to the lending side and then came over to the data side of the business. So what I always try to do when I go through this is talk a little bit about it's great to talk about the data, but put it in terms of kind of more day-to-day. So I'll try to give you some tips on information that you can actually glean from the credit report. When we started this, I would say this about 6-7 years ago, Ken Schulson and I, we did a poll to see how many dealers or buy here, pay here dealers actually use credit in their process. And I guess the good news is about 78% of them said they did. The rest of them said, no, I know they're bad, so why bother pulling a credit report? And I think one of the biggest things that jumped out to me was not were they pulling it or not, so we had the 78%, but about half of them said that they were beginner or fairly proficient in reading the credit report. And when you think about the type of loan or the asset that you're putting out on the road in a very risky segment, that's a little bit scary. So we started this session, it's one, like I said, it always amazes me. It's not always the most sexy topic, but it's the one that we keep being asked to do. So again, over the next 45 minutes, if you guys have questions, please feel free to ask, or we'll leave some time at the end. And hopefully you'll walk away today with some tips. I do have a little love note from my lawyers, and one thing that I can say is that I think it's really important when we cover off on some of the pieces today that you do have somebody that you go to make sure for your business that you ask questions. It's not easy. I'll give a quick overview of some of the regulations, but it is important if you're using credit and making lending decisions that you have the right people in place to guide you through that. So we're going to talk a little bit, about just the general credit process and some of the governing rules and regulations. We'll talk a little bit about what's in the database, but really where I want to spend the meat of the time is the information you can actually pull from the report and kind of moving beyond the consumer's credit score. So when you think about the world of credit, there's really three primary bodies that are involved. There's the CFPB, and obviously if you haven't heard those four letters in the last couple of years, you've got to have been hiding under a rock somewhere, because they've certainly been loud and clear in our ecosystem. But they're currently the regulator of the CRAs and creditors, and really where they focus in our business is around data quality, deceptive practices, discrimination, and updated regulations. And we were up in DC a couple weeks ago, and certainly that was definitely still seemed to be within the scope and the focus. There's the FTC, but I will say this, with Dodd-Frank, during the mid-2010, they transferred a lot of their oversight to the CFPB. And then the CDIA, so this is just like NABD or NIADA is your trade association. This is the Credit Bureau Trade Association. And I like to raise this one because if you ever within your business want to look for additional training, information, whether it's on the credit reports, underwriting, or looking at how to report trade lines, this is a great website and resource to check out. And I definitely encourage you, there's lots of people that'll ask you for more money, but having a site out there that'll have the information available, I definitely would take that away to go and review. And they do have a certification process as well if you want to go into deeper around just around the ecosystem in general. So when you think about the primary governing regulations, there's the Fair Credit Reporting Act. This is the one I think most people have heard about, and this is ultimately regulates how creditors and CRAs use the consumer information. And the key piece is it's important that you obviously have that permissible purpose to be able to access the consumer credit. There's the Fair and Accurate Transaction Act, which helps consumers protect themselves or respond to identity theft. And this will get into some of the fraud alerts that you'll see on the report. Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, this protects consumers' personal financial information and held by financial institutions. I will tell you, this is one that when I was at the dealership, you hear about it at a very high level, but understanding your obligations under this one, it's really important. So if you're not familiar, definitely go and look at some of this piece around protecting the consumer information. There's the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And this is, the key piece here is what protects consumers from discrimination. And again, there's some very clear black and white what can and cannot be used in a credit decision. And then there's certainly, depending on your state, there's quite a few various state legislation, whether it be sort of security freezes, the consumer matching, like for example, Rhode Island, if you're from, anybody from Rhode Island? All right, well, you can't actually use the Social Security number to match to a file in Rhode Island. So there's some nuanced stuff, and then purge rules. New York, California has different retention policies. So understanding some of that nuance, that was a very high level, but just it's important to know within your state what your obligations are when you're making credit decisions. So just from a database perspective, when you really look at what makes up the credit report, you've got things like the trade lines. This is going to give you up to 10 years history. There's things like account numbers, credit limits, and balance. I will tell you, I learned this the hard way. If you have somebody with a trade-in, don't take the payoff from the credit report. It's not always the most accurate. So if you're going to look at the trade line side of it, especially if you're looking at vehicles, go ahead and make sure you actually get the payoff from the other lending institution. Collections is going to have up to 7 years worth of information. We'll dive into this one a little bit later because this is one that you want to really pay attention to if you're going to be giving collateral out because there's potentially some risk. Public records, this is going to be where you see bankruptcies and liens. For the most part, up to about 7 years. There's a couple states that are 5. And then hard inquiries, which is going to give you things like which creditor or who's pulling and accessing the file. This one, a lot of times consumers will say, hey, how long will an inquiry stay on my file? So it's 24 months if you get that question. A lot of times, if you're a buy here, pay here operation, you'll see you're making that one inquiry, but if they've been to another dealership, you'll see quite a few inquiries. So that question comes up quite a bit, especially if the consumers struggle to get financing. So being able to share some of that information with them can be very valuable. Soft inquiries, I don't cover that a lot in today, but you're hearing more and more the use of soft pulls. The key piece you need to know about soft pulls is you will not see it on your report. Only the consumer can see it on their report. And the key piece is there's 3 reasons you have permissible purpose for soft pulls, and that's marketing. So if you're doing just a firm offer of credit, or you get those lovely direct mail pieces in your mailbox, employment, and then consumer education. So we recently did some research, and if you want to look at from a standpoint of where we say, just the depth of the file, we typically say 5 or more trade lines is where you see a true predictive performance. I'm guessing most of your customers typically fall into quite a bit more than 5. But if you're dealing with a thin file, no credit, we're going to talk about some other assets later on. But that's something that you generally want to see to really truly say, hey, what's going to be indicative or predictive from a consumer's patterns. This is the question that I constantly get is, well, how much do you really actually have on your credit, on the credit file? So we return files 97% of the time. We have over 1.6 billion trade lines that get updated monthly. We have a substantial number of inquiries. But if you look at the piece there, the number, the 94% contains at least one trade line. So when you think about your customers being able to go and access that file to see what's currently out there, their obligations or some of their prior history, that's what you can expect to see if you look at it from a 30,000-foot level. This is another question that I often get asked, how fresh is the data? Well, we actually update our entire database daily, sometimes multiple times a day. And we're constantly adding new information and new trade lines. There's been a big focus across all the different credit bureaus or the 3 credit bureaus to actually go ahead and also look at adding alternative data sources. So you see things like rental history, some of the shorter term payment loans. So you're just going to see the depth of this increase. One of the things that's specific to Equifax that you may get the question is that if you have to pull a consumer's credit multiple times in one day, that may be they had a freeze, they had to update. We actually only count that as one. So that's another question that often gets asked is, hey, if I pulled the person's credit 2 or 3 times, will that impact them? For us, we actually link that together and count it as one inquiry, as long as it comes from the same dealer location or the same finance company, from a standpoint of just tracing it back. If they go and get other dealerships, then similar rule, but that will count as a separate inquiry. So just diving in a little bit to the credit report, I always like to focus on the what's in. So when you show up and say, hey, I need a credit report, you're going to get the personal information. We'll go into some of the specific information, but you can see there this information. I would say best practice is when it comes to this piece is if you're looking at a driver's license, a document, or a contract that's got any variance between this, stop and ask why. Because oftentimes what you'll find, there's just the basic, hey, I'm Rob, or I'm Bob, or I'm Robert, which can cause some titling issues later. But this is where you start to see some variance. What people don't realize is within the credit report is it actually doesn't verify up against the Social Security Administration, because if you think about it, you got somebody that's just starting a file. We create it when we get that 9-digit number, and we start to collect the information. So if you start to see somebody who says driver's license is 24 and on the credit report it's 48, again, there's instances where what's happened is the linking and the logic is messed up, so you can start to see patterns. And a lot of times when people are just looking at the score, this is the type of stuff that gets missed. Trade lines, inquiries, public records, and scores and models. This is the what's out. And I always say this is kind of like the cheat sheet of what you shouldn't use when you are underwriting a loan. So one would be gender, ethnicity, religion, or political affiliation. Those would be absolutely nots. Medical history, criminal records, the actual items purchased by the credit card. I don't know about you guys, but I saw a lot of Finger Huts in the day. You don't need to know what they bought from Finger Hut. Checking your savings account data, and then motor vehicle records. This is usually the point that I do a public service announcement. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of sort of providers out there that have done a great job of reformatting the credit report. I'm using what I call the ugly report just because it's the hardest one to read. So for purposes of the different sections, I go ahead and show you this. But depending on where you get your credit reports, whether it's directly from the Bureau or you get it from a third party or reseller, you can actually reach out to them. Most of them have better formats. Some of them will let you actually configure that report to put the things that are most important up top. But aesthetically, whether it's yourself or people on your team, being able to easily access it and get some insight, obviously there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. And this is an area that we've been working on quite a bit over the last couple years. So when you look at the report, this is what we call the top part of the report. Oftentimes what I'll hear is, hey, I see there's a 3-digit score. So that's the credit score. I see it's a 501. I know it's not, now I know they're a subprime customer, so I got the information that I needed. This is where getting past that score and really looking at what's driving it can really add a lot of value to your business. One of the things I always point out is that people don't look at the report as configurable, but you can actually go ahead and put things like, there's fraud indicators, you can put different types of models, there's Vantage, there's bankruptcy scores, there's all sorts of different things that you can do to configure to your business. That what I'll say is not going to be as sophisticated as some of the technical solutions that are out there, but it lets you give a consistent way to measure the consumer that you're talking with. So that's one opportunity that you can sort of tailor it to your business. There's also an opportunity here to actually go ahead and put verification or identification solutions. So I'll show you how you can manually do that in some of the different sections, but you can also go ahead and put solutions on that will give you an alert on if there's mismatches of identities. One thing I do like to address is what many people don't realize is the FICO score or the 3-digit score that everybody associates with the files is not actually owned by the 3 credit bureaus. So it is an algorithm, effectively a black box. We provide the data that gets run through the FICO score. So, I often will get stopped in the airport and say, hey, Jen, can you help me fix my FICO score? Nope, but I can help you fix the data if it's inaccurate on the report. So that's just something to think about, that the score is driven by the data. So look what's in the data. So if you see something difference between the different bureaus, that means there's something different in the data, or you're using a different score model. The score that was created by the 3 credit bureaus is the Vantage score. That's the one that you see oftentimes on your Credit Karmas, or there's generic scores that you'll see in some of the bank sites. What I'll share with you there is it's just another sort of score version. A lot of times, though, and this was something that I saw with my customers, was they can't understand, well, why does this site say my score is this and you're showing me something different? And obviously, dealers aren't always the most trusted by consumers, so you're instantly wrong. But what I encourage everybody is myfico.com, or there's a couple different sites out there. There's annualcreditreport.com. There's some great information out there, so have a third-party site that you can point people to. They do a really nice job of explaining why there's different scores and what those variances are. The other piece I'll say here is there's reason codes that you can use, and it's an objective way. Instead of saying, hey, you're what we call a subprime customer, you can actually use those score or reason codes to explain to a consumer why their score might be what it is. High debt revolving, high number of inquiries. So you'll see that there, and that's a great place that you can actually point to on the report to tell them what drove or impacted the score. So we can actually, the formatting on the report actually lets you get up to 20 scores. FICO, there's 3 kind of common FICO scores that you see in the auto ecosystem, but you can put multiple scores. You can put FICO, you can put Vantage, you can put bankruptcy scores, but that's all configurable based on how you want to set it up. Oh, what is required by FACTA? You're actually not required to have a score on there. There's actually some dealers that don't put scores on there. And sorry if I'm not hearing you correctly.
No, sorry. Yeah, under score it says required by FACTA. So I'm just trying to understand what is required by FACTA.
So if you're going to have the required by FACTA, the score disclosure, like if you're going to have a score, obviously you have to disclose it. But under FACTA, if you're going to have somebody's impacted by that score, like a credit decision, you have to basically provide them the reason code for why that was. So those reason codes. Not reason codes, those reasons are what is required to be disclosed to the consumer.
So not the score itself?
Correct.
Oh, okay, thanks.
But yeah, we do actually have some dealers that choose not to use scores. We also, like I said, some of the other things I've seen is we have some dealers that are testing using Vantage with the FICO so that they can show the consumer the difference. So I think you'll see more solutions here in the future. Especially now with credit cards and other companies using a lot of the more generic scores. And a lot of that, a lot of folks say, well, why do they do that? It comes down to cost, in a lot of cases, or they're using something that's more configured to their business. So, but just like you can configure this, lenders are doing some of that today as well. The one piece here on the fraud alerts, again, you can have sort of a solution that you purchase that says, hey, there's potential fraud here. But if you actually just look at the report, it will alert you to if a consumer has placed what they say is like an initial fraud alert on. So that's a, hey, I've been a victim in the last 90 days. And then they can actually put an extension on there, and that alert stays on file for 7 years. I have actually seen loans be originated to people that clearly had fraud alerts, but because they looked at the credit score and they didn't look at the rest of it, later on discovered, hey, lo and behold, this was a victim of fraud, and it wasn't the identity. So, it's very obvious, and this is something I tell people, hey, if you see a fraud alert, make sure it is who they say they are. But this is one that you really should look at and take a look at. Military as well is another one. I haven't seen this as much, but I would say about 3-4 years ago, there was a point in time where you were seeing this increase. If you've got somebody that's got an active duty military alert on and they're sitting in front of you, again, you should just be making sure that you do the due diligence to understand that the person is there. We did see some cases where people were serving overseas, and whether it was spouses or using power of attorneys, going out and getting vehicles, and then they came back and lo and behold to discover they got a car they didn't know about, and that's not something that they need in their life. So if you see this one, there's different sources that you can go ahead and check. Just make sure the person is they say they are. Alert contact, this is where, and I'll say this is probably the one that causes a lot of angst when a consumer is sitting at the dealership, is they'll read, hey, I could go and put a freeze on, or I can put a notation that says don't issue credit unless you've talked to me, but what they do is they forget to put the phone number on because of the fact that we don't actually, from a legal perspective, we can't require they put the phone number on. This is one where I would provide the guidance that if you have that, just get the person on. They either need to remove the alert, or they need to go ahead and add a phone number. And technically, you're supposed to call and verify that person before you issue a loan to them. But you'll see this with other third-party lenders. A lot of times, they'll be sitting in the showroom, and if you're out trying to get a loan, they can't actually issue that loan until they get this cleared. Address discrepancy. This is where we actually bounce it up against the ones that we have on our file. And you can imagine in this ecosystem, this is one that you'll see a lot of, especially in the rental, you'll see folks move around quite a bit. When you're talking about your collateral and wanting to understand where your vehicle is going to be kept, taking a look at this section, understanding the pattern and how often they're moving, and getting an explanation for the different addresses can be really helpful when it comes to potentially finding that vehicle later. So, just generally, I would say this is one that if you're seeing consistency in the address, great. But if you do see some variance, just asking for simple explanation so that you can sort of say, hey, is this a likely possible place I'm going to have to find my vehicle later, or where is this going to actually be garaged? The consumer referral message, this shows the address that needs to be used on the adverse action letters and decline letters. I know most software providers, if you're pulling the report, they'll actually go ahead and provide this service to you. But if you are starting out and smaller and you're using forms for your adverse action letters, this is where whoever is showing, so whether it's Experian, TU, Equifax, you want to make sure that that's the CRA that you direct them to. And that's ultimately, if there's any discrepancies or anything they want to challenge, that's where they need to go to do that. Consumers, just so you can share this with your customers, are entitled to one free credit report per year, and unless they've been denied for a loan, then they can actually go and get a copy of the credit report and work to make those corrections as well. And I give this announcement, and again, I will admit I was one of those that learned the hard way, but you're not a credit bureau, don't give them their credit report. So a lot of times customers will say, hey, can I get a copy of that? You want to refer them to the credit reporting agency, or you want to go to annualcreditreport.com. Do not give them a copy of their credit report. Identification. This gives you, this section gives you insight into what is on the report. It will show up to 3 addresses. Again, we talked about that in the previous section, and the value of having those multiple different addresses. It gives you landline phone number. So again, we're seeing more and more cell phone numbers, but you don't typically see a lot of changes in phone numbers. So if you're seeing that on the report, again, understanding what the different phone numbers are is important. And it'll also show you the source and when it was reported. So you'll see how current and that information is. You'll also see in this section additional information, so like former names, date of births, and you can go ahead and add SSN verification. There's certain pockets of the country where there's high occurrences of fraud for SSNs. So this is an example of something you can configure the report to add on to it. I will say, when you see the date of births, it's not uncommon when you see a fraud to see discrepancies in that point. So looking at that information and seeing the difference is another area that you can see a red flag. Employment, this is something, and there's various forms of marketing out there that talks about, hey, the credit report has marketing on it, employment on it. One thing to understand here is this is self-reported, so it's not verified. So when you submit the application, you put their employment information in, that's where we can't capture it from. And I'll tell you a story of, I looked at a guy's credit app one day, and it was a stock guy at Walmart who suddenly became the general manager all in the course of a week. So you can imagine when people are shopping for a vehicle, they're not getting the outcome they want, whether it's the consumer or the dealers they're working with, the information can change. When you see those things, make sure you have the right information. And I'll just leave it at that. But it's unlikely that somebody went from the stock to the general manager in the course of a week. So you also need to make sure you and your employees are aware that the information you submit goes on their credit report. So this is something that, just be aware and sensitive to the fact that that's going to show up for the next person, and they're going to have to go through the process to get it corrected and provide information if it's not accurate. So doing as much as you can to make sure the information's accurate serves everybody in the long run. And this is, again, another place that you'll see, especially if a customer's been to multiple dealerships, where you'll see discrepancies. Summary of file items. Again, this is your traditional, just what you think about on the report. So what are the oldest and the newest trade line? This is kind of your summary of just what you're going to find in the detail. It'll show you the public records, number of trades, the high trade amounts. I will share, this is what I used to use in the section of the summary to actually calculate and sit down with customers to understand their budget and what they can afford, and making sure that you captured all of their information. And if you're wanting, looking at things like liabilities, like collections, this was a great place to just have that conversation with a customer on a report. I had a worksheet that I did to help the customer, and this is where I say you can help customers set up for success. Give them a really real picture. I had my what was on the credit report, and then I had the what are all the things that you pay for that's not on the credit report, and then we would get to a calculation of what they could afford from a vehicle perspective. So just something to consider. The inquiry alert will show when you've got a bunch of inquiries. Again, the world of Dealer Track and Route 1, it's not uncommon if they've been shopping for a vehicle where you'll see 15, 20 different inquiries. Again, one of the simple questions that you can ask a consumer is, what didn't work at all of these other places that has you here? And obviously, intuitively, a lot of times the credit is a big problem, but having that conversation up front and understanding the experience they've gone through can really help set you apart. Bankruptcies. Again, this is something, having sat in bankruptcy court, not a ton of fun, but this will show you your Chapter 7s or your 13s. It'll show you whether it's discharged or not, or if it's pending or dismissed. If you do or are in the business of working with folks that have open Chapter 7s or 13s, open 13s, you're going to want to make sure you understand the process and working with the trustee and doing the budget of that piece. This is not an area that I would go into unless you've done quite a bit of research and you've got a program set up in place. And you also want to understand as well whether it's joint or individual. The collection section, this is going to give you your open obligations. I always say this is really important because this is what you call your future liens. So if you're going to end up with collateral on the road, just be aware of what could be a risk to that collateral. It does show the value of those collections. And again, another conversation is understanding what plans they have in place or what additional payment arrangements they have in place to help satisfy those collections, because that is payments that may not be showing up that is impacting their budget. Judgments, again, pretty self-explanatory. This will give you the detail of all the judgments that are out there. Sometimes things won't show satisfied, so understanding whether something has been satisfied or not, or if they can prove, a lot of times you'll see, especially around tax season, where somebody gets money and they'll go ahead and pay off the judgment and it just hasn't been updated. This is not an industry, especially when you get to the collections, that is always the most timely in updating their information. So just going ahead and making sure you have actual information, I would say is a best practice. And then the tax liens. These are the ones that obviously, they're going to get paid one way or another. So they don't typically, they're the hardest. They don't get written off. So this is going to be something that you're going to want to understand as you're going through, especially if there's any payment plans in place before you're putting your cars out on the road. Inquiries, we talked about this a little bit already. This is going to show all the inquiries for the last 2 years. It does show you the industry type. Again, one of the things we've noticed is oftentimes when somebody gets a car, they want to get a mortgage and they want to get a credit card and they want to get, so understanding, and I'll show you some of those industry codes in a minute, but understanding what is like I'm car shopping versus other debts that may be coming into the picture. A lot of times people just go, whoa, there's a bunch of inquiries, but they don't look at what the type of inquiries are. Understanding that, again, can drastically change their debt or their profile, and having that conversation with a consumer can be a good proactive way to understand what's going on or if they're going to have a move coming up. Trade lines, not going to spend a ton of time on this one. You're going to see 2 years of behavior. Ultimately, you want to look for trends. Something that you may want to look at, given the time of year, is the payment patterns. a lot of times what you'll see for folks that are living paycheck to paycheck is there'll be different patterns throughout the year. So you can see seasonal employment, if somebody's a landscaper or doing a lot in the summer and they're off during the winter. Holidays, tax seasons, you'll see differences. So understanding that can actually go, this is a relationship business. So understanding that, knowing what's going on, and having that proactive dialogue can really go a long way with this segment. And a lot of folks just don't realize, you'll see 222, they're slow paying, and then it'll catch up at tax season. Well, pretty self-explanatory what happens. But it also gives you a picture of what's going on in their life. This is also where, between this and the summary, this is where I also use this to help calculate some of the debt ratios, or if they're replacing a vehicle, just find that trade line and look at it. And also seeing just what the status of their previous vehicle history is, and then just the terms around the obligation side of it. You also can see here whether there's joint or individual. This is insightful if you got somebody that's an individual, but most of their debt's joint, understanding what's going on, or vice versa. And again, that'll just be next to the trade line. It also shows where delinquency and that first date, and again, understanding if there's an event that's happened in the consumer's life, and is it getting better or worse, triangulating it back to where you see that delinquency, like was it a one-time event or is it a continued behavior, are very different risk profiles. Status of trade lines, again, you have the summary that'll show you the bankruptcy, whether it's been discharged or whether it's something that is still currently open. But you also see from a trade line perspective, if something's included in the bankruptcy, obviously there's no longer the obligation. You'll see stolen credit, charge off, paid as agreed. So if you ever have questions on what's happening with specific accounts, this is kind of the source of truth when it comes to what the status of those are. Payment grid, this is again, just when you look at the numbers on the 24 months, this is what each of those numbers mean. So obviously, if you see a 1, that's what we like to see, but all the way down to a 9, which is a charge-off. And you'll see a pattern over periods of time where obviously things goes from 2 to 3 to 4. It's getting worse. If it's going the other direction, things are getting better. And again, that's a very different risk profile. We talked about this one. Individual, joint, and authorized users are what you're going to traditionally see on the credit reports of consumers that you're talking with, but this is, again, the different codes that you can see for the different accounts. And then industry codes, this is where I mentioned before on inquiries, you'll actually see that there's different industry codes before it. So this is how you tell whether it's a credit card or a mortgage. Traditionally, in this space, you're going to see, if it's an auto inquiry, you're going to see AN, which is franchise, AU, which is used, or BC, which is bank card or credit card, and then FA, which is auto finance. So, like I said, this is just a cheat sheet to let you know what it is, so it'll give you a sense for what else they're out there shopping for, they may have recently acquired. So with that, that's was going through very quickly the credit report, but you can see that there's quite a bit of information there. And I challenge most people that there's some guys that are great, they go through the detail, and then there's others that, they see the score, they say, hey, I know what I've got, but there is a world of information there. So if you're making the investment to go ahead and pull the credit, I definitely encourage everybody to look at and truly get the insight from it. The other piece, I talked about this during the earlier part of the session, which is the income and employment information. That, as I said, was self-inputted. We do actually have a database, and this is one of the alternative datas that we've brought into the market, and quite a few of the buy here, pay here's use, and that's the work number. And so the work number is a real-time database where we actually source from the employer the income, employment, and the payroll records. So we have over 99 million records. And this is where, for example, like your Walmarts or Home Depot, if you go to try to verify employment, they'll actually tell you to call the work number. Well, this is a service you actually have available to you, and you can go ahead and pull this, whether it's with the report, separate to the report, but it'll give you the actual information as of their last payment paycheck. And it gives you the opportunity as well. So a lot of folks are using it up front so that you can get verified information. It's also a way to improve the consumer experience, because if you think of the old world where you have to go send the person home, get paycheck stubs, or ask them for their stips, you can actually, with the consumer consent, pull this information to provide a little bit less friction. And we have solutions in place as well that if you want to monitor your portfolio, you can actually see changes in changes in the job type. So we call that income and employment alerts. And it'll actually show you, like you'll have somebody, for example, that gets promoted. Well, that's somebody that may be time to move into a different vehicle, or you'll also see folks that lose jobs. And so you can actually proactively work with that customer instead of waiting till it becomes a collection account. So there's a lot of account strategies that you can leverage this for. The key piece is that it's for the purposes of verification, so you don't actually use it from a decisioning perspective. As well as if you're working out payment arrangements, understanding real information on what that consumer is bringing in can be a really strong value. And this is some of the different elements that you can actually get from the work number. And this is available via a storefront, so you can log in. There's certain providers that have it with the credit report. So we have multiple different ways that you can go ahead and access this information. So with that, any questions? Yeah, so some of them, I believe.
Like I see C a lot on Experian.
You see, sorry, what?
C.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
co-borrower.
No, as far as the status, like.
Oh, for charge off.
No, it's generally current.
So the answer would be then they're not the same.
Then they're not the same. Okay. Do you have the rate codes for the other bureaus?
I don't.
Okay.
But I will say this. Check out their sites, because this is something we have out there.
Okay.
So make it available. What is the same is this piece, the industry codes. So industry codes, and then the I, the J, the A. Their format, each of them are a little different format too, and it depends on how you get them. So I've seen check marks, I've seen zeros, so it depends. Any other questions?
Jen, I got one. You said that you can't give the report to the consumer, and we understand you'd be a credit reporting agency, but you can review that with the consumer as long as they are the only ones in the room, or unless it's a joint file with a husband and wife. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, so you're able to review it, and obviously you need to be able to, if you're taking action off of it, you provide them an adverse action on what those reasons were. But yeah, you cannot give them a copy of their credit report.
Right.
And that's the other side I will say too, is employees be very sensitive to that credit report getting passed around. You need to, that's why I said some of those previous regulations, understand you need to keep that safe and secure. Make sure that just not anybody at the dealership has access to it.
So exactly how do you ascertain this information?
This is part of the work number, which is a solution we have with the credit report. If you give Jason or Claire your information, we'll just shoot you an email so you can, we have like a coupon code so you can go in and try it. My suggestion would be, and Jason can follow up with you to get you more information. We have a couple different ways. You can come directly to us, you can go through a third party, but just for your sake, talk with Jason here and he'll get you set up.
So, and even if they use a small payroll company, would you be able to get information?
Yes. So in the past, the work number, we had about 82% of the Fortune 500 companies. We recently, through partnerships, have actually gone ahead and onboarded a lot of the small and mid-sized payrolls. So as of January 1st, you'll see a drastic increase, especially in the smaller providers. They're already in there, so.
Just following up on that, so what would be the hit rate for?
It depends on the segment. So it's tough to say. So what we see, like, if you look at, and I just looked at this last week, so if you look at overall right now with these new records in, we're seeing over 40%. But what we traditionally see in this segment is actually higher. And the reason for that is the type of employers we have. We have like the Walmarts and the Home Depots. So it fits in line with more of what you're going to traditionally see in that subprime customer. So we have some people that are actually getting over 50% in the deep subprime segment. But generally the range we give is anywhere, the 25 to 55, but on average you should see about over 40% with these new records.
And that across all states?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah,
Thank
this is state agnostic. And then obviously the credit report, it's 97% hit rate. So, any other questions? Well, I'll offer this up. I've been coming to this conference now for, 5, 6, 7 years. One of the things, you guys are near and dear to my heart. So if you guys ever have questions, you're running into issues, no, I can't go in and fix people's credit. But my email is jennifer.reid@equifax.com. I'm really easy to get a hold of. So if you just need to be pointed to somebody or, have any sort of follow-up questions, you're always welcome to reach out. So, and NIADA and NABD know where to find me. So. Feel free to reach out to them as well. So appreciate the time today. Thank you.